Good evening, Moon Princess here, and tonight we are going to talk about the crawlers of London. I'm trying out fake nails on one side for the tingles, of course. I have a very hard time with long nails this length. I prefer a little bit shorter because I can't do anything with them. I mean, I'm sure if I had them long enough, I would adjust, but I don't know. It's not really my style 100%. So we're just gonna go with it. So let's get started with crawlers. Crawlers of Victorian London. So this information can be found if you look up information on John Thompson. I believe he wrote the depictions. So again, John Thompson and the crawlers of Victorian London huddled together on the workshop steps in Short's Gardens. Those wrecks of humanity, the crawlers of St. Giles, may be seen both day and night, seeking mutual warmth and mutual consolation in their extreme misery. As a rule, they are old women reduced by vice and poverty to that degree of wretchedness which destroys even the energy to beg. They have not the strength to struggle for bread and prefer starvation to the activity which an ordinary mendicant must display. As a natural consequence, they cannot obtain money for a lodging or for food. Hence, beggars of slightly greater circumstances in comparison take pity on the beggars below them. This with lower fortune, begging beggars, those of lower fortune, beg on the beggars of slightly greater circumstances in comparison. Little charity was afforded to the poor of London then. What little charity they received is more frequently derived from the lowest orders. They beg from beggars, and the energetic, prosperous mendicant is in his turn called upon to give to those who are his inferiors. In the profession, crawlers, they sit on the hard stone step of the workhouse, their heads reclining on the door. And here, by old custom, they are left undisturbed. Sound sleep described as an unknown luxury. This peculiarity has earned them the nickname of noses, derived from the verb to doze, by which they are sometimes recognized. They are those who sleep with one eye open, though they might look to be asleep. If someone approaches, they look up, noting their arrival. Sustenance, stale bread, half-used tea leaves, and on gala days, the fly blown bone of a joint are their principal items of diet. A broken jug or a teapot without spout or handle constitutes the domestic crockery in this stale tea leaves, or perhaps if one of the company has succeeded in begging a penny or halfpenny worth of new tea is carefully placed, then one of the women rises and crawls slowly towards Drury Lane, where there is a coffee shopkeeper and also a publican who take compassion on these women supply them gratuitously with boiling water. Warm tea is thus procured at a minimum cost, and the poor women's lives prolonged. But old age and want of proper food and rest reduces them to a lethargic condition, which can scarcely be preferable to death itself. It will be noticed that they are constantly dozing and yet are never really asleep. Some of them are unable to lie down for days. The misery of being a crawler with little means is not something they intended for their lives or earned, but consequence of unfortunate circumstances rather. The story of the lady on the step, the crawler for instance, whose portrait is now before the reader, all included in this video, is the widow of a tailor who died some 10 years ago. Following his death, she lived with her son-in-law. He was a marble polisher and developed some health problems. She'd been living with her son-in-law. Sorry, I just said that. I'm sorry. Taking her teenage son at 15, she left the home, which she described as having become uncomfortable. This leads to her current predicament. She became homeless and lived on the street. She became worse off and eventually became the crawler she was immortalized as in the famous photo. Having worked as a tailoress, she was no longer able to due to poor eyesight. She hopes to work and complete menial labor tasks, though her chances of gaining employment after reaching this point are much lower. That's the problem with homelessness. The longer you're homeless, the harder it is to get a job, because you have to meet certain qualifications to be eligible to get a job. So it's a vicious cycle kind of thing. Who would be willing to employ someone in her position in Victorian England? She has no residence, no permanent address to provide, and no money. Does this sound familiar? Her son is no better off, and how might he hope to improve their circumstances? Her son, equally homeless and ragged, cannot, for the same reasons, hope to obtain work. But on the other hand, I convinced myself after a long conversation that this woman thoroughly realized her position and had a very clear idea as to what she should do to redeem herself. She dreamed of being able to obtain a few shillings and earn enough to get her son's clothes out of pawn, obtain work again, rent them a room, and have their own address, all in hopes she might obtain work again. Another well-known crawler had consented to have her portrait taken in company with that of the woman whose circumstances I have already described. But on the previous evening, a gentleman gave her 6 pence while she was strolling down Albemarle Street. This enabled her to indulge in a night's lodging, and she was so unaccustomed to the luxury of a bed that she overslept herself and thus missed the appointment. She's a tall, bony, gray-haired Scotswoman, and wears a hideous gray, waterproof fasten around her, as is safe, considering the feeble and worn nature of its texture. It is not known that she has any underclothing. There is only a muddy, nondescript substance hanging loosely around the lower part of her legs, which may sought refuge in the casual ward 3 times in the course of 1 month. To risk what is equivalent to 3 days imprisonment with hard labor for the sake of spending 1 in the casual ward testifies to a degree of misery and want that beggars all description. But the horror of this picture is intensified when we consider that it is often undeservedly endured. Scotty, for instance, is no criminal, nor is she even a drunkard. No amount of pressure on my part could persuade her to drink even a single glass of beer with the dinner, which, of course, I found an early opportunity for giving her. Further, she is neither stupid nor ignorant. She can read and write well, and her language is at times even polished and refined. How under these circumstances she could have become a crawler was at first an inexplicable mystery. But gradually I discovered one by one the chief incidents in her career, and it all seemed so natural that it was difficult to doubt her word. Scotty's husband had been employed in a bank at Edinburgh, and at one time assessed property to the value of £2,000, I think. But this was sold and the proceeds placed in the hands of some lawyers. I do not know whether Scotty's husband was also born north of the Tweed, but in any case, he was not gifted with that spirit of economy which, when it does not lead to the vice of meanness, is one of the chief characteristic virtues of Scotchmen. At every moment, whenever he experienced the least want of money, he applied to his lawyers till at last they one day informed him that there was none remaining. His first impression was that he had been egregiously robbed, but he had not kept any account of the sums received, and was therefore quite helpless. The poverty-stricken couple came up to London, and Scotty soon found herself a widow, alone and friendless. She nevertheless bravely struggled against adversity and obtained work as a tailoress, but an illness almost deprived her of her eyesight. So long as her eyes remained inflamed, she wasn't able to work, and consequently fell into debt till at last she was turned out of her room and her things seized and sold. Harshness on the part of her landlord did not, however, crush the poor woman. She had no money to pay a week's rent in advance so as to obtain a private room, and was therefore compelled to go to a common lodging house, but she determined to spend the whole of the next day searching for work, and for some more respectable abode. During the night, however, a final catastrophe destroyed all these hopes. A fellow lodger stole all her clothes. Protestations and complaints were all in vain. It was impossible to detect the thief, and poor Scotty, like the Cardinal Wolsey, but in a more literal sense, found herself left naked to her enemies. Her petticoats, underlinen skirt, apron, boots, all were gone. Nothing but her waterproof, which fortunately she had put over her bed, remained. In this plight, it was impossible to apply for work. No one was at hand to help or to suggest a remedy, and shivering with cold and almost naked, Scotty went out into the streets, which were henceforth to become her only home. Hunger and cold soon reduced her to still deeper gloom and helplessness, till at last she gladly availed herself of the meager shelter available on the workhouse steps. At times, the stupor that is intense suffering obtains such complete sway over her mind and body that she is unable to stand or walk. accustomed to it now. I have not fallen once the whole of this week. What, however, I cannot endure is the awful, lazy, idle life I am forced to lead. It is 1,000 times worse than the hardest labor. That's so interesting. And I would much rather my hands were cut, blistered, and sore with toil than as you see them, swollen and red and smarting from the exposure to the sun, the rain, and the cold. Gradually she seemed to recover her old energy. If she could only obtain a decent set of clothes, she would seek employment at the army stores in Pimlico, where she had worked in her more prosperous days. Here she could earn 7 shillings a week. An old woman who she had met in a mission hall had offered to share her room, a back kitchen with her for 18 pence a week. Scotty had been obliged to refuse this offer, as she had no earthly prospect of being able to pay even the 18 pence. But if ever she got work again, this was the style of arrangement she would make. Then she would spend 4 shillings a week on her food, which she declared would be ample, particularly as she knew where to get excellent porridge. See, she's still got a wonderful attitude. There would therefore remain out of 7 shillings per week and about 18 pence for clothes. Such was the ambition of this poor woman, and yet, for want of the slight assistance necessary to attain this modest end, she had been compelled to live the life of a crawler for nearly 2 months. Imbued with pride that does honor to her nationality, Scotty has stubbornly rejected all suggestions as her entering the workhouse. It does not, I believe, condescend to beg. Sometimes persons take compassion on her, and seeing her forlorn appearance, give her a few pence, but had it been her practice to beg, she would never have endured all the misery I have but feebly described. Perhaps, however, with the help that will now be